Let me read to you a passage from the 17th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, verses 10 to 13. It's the Gospel for Saturday of the second week in Advent. St. Matthew writes, "The disciples asked Jesus, 'Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?' Jesus replied, 'To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands.' Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist." That's from Matthew chapter 17, verses 10 to 13. What does it suggest to us? Well, there are many magnificent people who are the protagonists of what the Christian calls the Old Testament. Many magnificent people. There is a magnificence about Abraham and his faith in God. We read how he understood God to have ordered him to sacrifice his son Isaac, which he thereupon prepared to do. In the event, God intervened to prevent the deed, but Abraham's obedient faith had been manifested. And we could go on to cite, as does the letter to the Hebrews, example after example of outstanding faith exhibited by the patriarchs, by Moses, the prophets, and certain of the kings and priests. Particularly intrepid was the great Elijah, and we remember how he withstood the 400 prophets of Baal. In one great demonstration of faith, he vindicated the truth of Yahweh and dealt a tremendous blow to the worship of Baal. In some mysterious sense, it was prophesied that Elijah would return to prepare the way of the Lord. And we read in the Gospel of St. John that priests and Levites from Jerusalem had asked John the Baptist, if he were the Elijah who was to come. John said with humility that he was not, but in our Gospel passage today, our Lord declares that he was. Years later, when Luke wrote his Gospel, he included the prediction of the angel Gabriel to Zechariah, presumably the source being the Virgin Mary, that his son John would be great in the sight of the Lord and would act in the spirit and power of Elijah. John was the gift of the Lord to his chosen people to prepare for the Lord a people fit to receive him, in Luke chapter 1 verse 17. And as such was the fulfillment of the prophecy of Malachi, chapter 4 verse 6. In John the Baptist, kinsman of our Lord himself, Elijah has already come, as our Lord said. But, sadly, they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. The power of evil had been very great. There is in the Old Testament a pattern of moral magnificence and moral squalor, the two in conflict, and the latter all too often overcoming the former. In the third book of Kings, Elijah has his victorious showdown with the prophets of Baal, chapter 18. And then he flees from the wrath of Jezebel and arrives at the mountain of God, Horeb. We remember the gripping story in Exodus of the meeting between Yahweh God and Moses on this same mountain centuries before. At Horeb, Elijah has his famous conversation with Yahweh, and the theophany is very different in his case. The Lord speaks within the gentle breeze, and he instructs Elijah to anoint Elisha, the son of Zaphat, to be his successor, chapter 19. And now anointed, Elisha becomes his disciple and his successor in waiting. Finally, in the fourth book of Kings, chapter 2, Elijah is taken up to heaven in the chariot and the whirlwind, while Elisha takes up the mantle of the prophet and proceeds to his own magnificent ministry. We can surely see in this a prefiguring of the prophetic mantle passing from John the Baptist to Jesus Christ. For Christ confirms that John was the Elijah to come. Elijah met with tremendous opposition, and John too, our Lord points out, was treated as they pleased. But Christ surpasses all in every respect. His miracles were far greater and more numerous. His teaching had a loftiness without parallel, and his holiness surpassed all before him. The scale of his rejection and his sufferings also far exceeded the suffering prophets who had preceded him. And this is what our Lord alludes to in his conversation with his disciples in the gospel passage I read. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands, he says. And so it is that the patterns we perceive in the Old Testament illustrate the patterns we see in our Lord's life and ministry. Above all, as pointed out earlier, we see the pattern of moral magnificence and moral squalor, the two in conflict, with the latter all too often overcoming the former. But the good is not overcome. Precisely through sufferings, precisely through persecutions, the good prevails. Mysteriously, the Messiah has to suffer in order to enter his glory. He must suffer rejection at the hands of those who are evil, if the world is to be redeemed. Just as John suffered, so too must the Messiah, to whom was passed the prophetic mantle. What this means is that the mystery of evil and suffering become a source of life and goodness. The pattern present all through the scriptures and present in the prophetic ministry of, for instance, Elijah and John the Baptist, is supremely present in the ministry of Jesus Christ. Death leads to life if we die in God. It is the great revelation which God has given to a broken world. The Messiah, by his life and death, has lit up the meaning of the scriptures, which themselves point to him. By his life, he lights up the meaning of suffering and death, if we suffer and die with him. Let us take up the mantle then, as did Elisha from Elijah, and as did Christ from John. Our mantle is that of Jesus Christ.